Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 34 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have lost 6-2. And it was only a couple of days ago where the Sharks faced off against the Pittsburgh Penguins and got absolutely destroyed in that first period, fell behind 6-1, and while they would end up making it close and they showed some nice resolve, it was a game in the end that the Sharks would not be in any way proud of, and we're looking to sort of just move past it as a small bump in the road to try and potentially get into a playoff spot by the end of the season. So it seemed as though the Sharks could put that game behind them and come here against the Detroit Red Wings and put up a better performance, especially when you consider the fact that the Penguins had been coming in on a 7-game road winning streak, one of the hottest teams in the league, compared to the Detroit Red Wings, who really haven't been all that good, especially as of late this season. And in the first period, this is kind of how it goes. Besides that pretty unlucky goal, I would say, scored by Tyler Bertuzzi that would make it 1-0 Detroit by the end of the first period, the Sharks did a pretty decent job defending, and while there wasn't a ton of offensive chances, I would say that the general feel by the end of that first period was that, besides the unlucky goal, we actually played a decent first period. Let's kind of continue like that, and we should be able to come back and potentially win this game. However, the wheels did not stay on. They absolutely came off come the start of the second period, and this actually goes back to how the first period ended, where Jacob Middleton takes a hit from behind from one of the Red Wings players, who ends up getting a 5-minute major, and as such giving the Sharks a 5-minute power play. Now, the Sharks' power play hasn't been great as of late, though it did score a goal against the Pittsburgh Penguins in the previous game, but the Sharks definitely weren't expecting how terribly it would end up going here tonight. Now, at the end of the first period, they had about a minute and a half or 2 minutes of power play time, didn't get anything generated. Okay, whatever, let's come out to start the second period fresh. Well, at the start of the second period, they had about 3 minutes to work with, and it honestly felt as though it was a Detroit Red Wings 3-minute major power play compared to a San Jose Sharks power play, because it was the Red Wings getting the majority of the chances and the majority of the goals. They would score not one but two shorthanded goals and would find themselves up 3-0 just a couple of minutes into that third period. The Sharks would manage to respond pretty quickly after with a goal from Weatherby to make it 3-1, but then a few minutes later, the Red Wings would take back the 3-goal lead, moving it to 4-1, and it would cap off a pretty bad second period for the San Jose Sharks. They played an awful first period a couple days ago against the Pittsburgh Penguins, a rather awful second period here tonight against the Detroit Red Wings. They only need an awful third period in the game in a couple of days, and they can combine those 3 periods to create the worst game played by an NHL team ever. Yay for the San Jose Sharks. Going into the third period, I guess hope wasn't completely lost, because the Sharks did come back, although it did take they had a lot of time to do it compared to just one period here tonight. They did come back from a 5-goal deficit to bring it to within 1, so a 3-goal deficit didn't seem insurmountable, and early in the third period, maybe there were sparks of some life. Adin Hill came in relief of James Reimer, just as Sawchenko did in relief of James Reimer in the second period against the Penguins. And the Sharks very early on in the third got a goal from Barabanov to make it 4-2. However, Adin Hill did not see the same success as Sawchenko did in his relief performance of James Reimer, and then let in 2 very quick goals to get the Red Wings to a 4-goal lead, and that would pretty much do it for the game. The Red Wings would end up taking the victory 6-2, another lopsided score for the San Jose Sharks, who have now let in at least 6 goals in 3 of their last 4 games, and this is all 6 goals all on a manned net. This isn't a 6-goal game where the Sharks gave up 2 empty netters. Nope. Every single one of these goals were scored on a goaltender. Now, moving on to the players here tonight, unlike in the previous game against the Pittsburgh Penguins, I did stay tuned to this one because, of course, it didn't end up so lopsided early on like the Penguin game did. And so we can take a look at this first line. There were some issues with the Sharks lineup, as Logan Couture ends up leaving the lineup due to the COVID protocol. So replacing him on that first line was Tomas Hertl, centering both Meyer and Dahlin at the very least to start the night. And I would say this was probably the somewhat only effective line, and honestly I shouldn't even say it was an effective line so much as it was an effective duo. Hertl and Meyer were pretty much the 2 players who were generating any of the scoring chances. There weren't a ton of these scoring chances, so mind you not that these two players didn't play that great here tonight, but at the very least they had a couple of chances here or there. But with just how short-handed the Sharks are offensively, and you take a look at these 12 forwards that they were icing, is it really that much of a surprise that they're the only two players generating a ton of offensive chances for themselves? Yes and no, I would say. Obviously, there are a couple other players you're expecting something to step up from, but otherwise, these are really the two best players for the San Jose Sharks, and there's kind of a steep fall off after them. When it comes to their line mate, Dahlin, he didn't really stay on their line for that long here tonight. He ended up getting replaced near the end of the game by Barabanov, and that was the line that ended up scoring the goal early in the third period. Dahlin hasn't looked all that great in his last few games, just not really having that same magic that he had earlier on. Is that a product of the fact that he's been dealing with injuries here or there, some COVID protocol situations that just hasn't really allowed him to stay a consistent part in the lineup? It's possible. We'll see if maybe when things settle down a bit, if Dahlin can find a bit more consistency back on potentially a first line with Meyer and Couture, but right now it's not looking too great. On the second line, we had Barabanov and Gregor being centered by Nick Bonino, who of course had to step into the second line center role because Hertl was stepping into the first line center role. Now, from earlier on this season, we already know that Nick Bonino does not look particularly good when he's playing in the top six. It was a disaster experiment when he was tried on the top line a couple of months ago, and here tonight he did have a couple of offensive chances, but certainly not anywhere near what you would hope for from a second line center, which was a role he was thrust in for this particular game. Barabanov didn't look necessarily all that great when he was on this particular line, though he definitely looked improved, unsurprisingly, when he was placed with Meyer and Hertl in the third period. And when it comes to Noah Gregor, I mean, I tweeted this out during the game, but I will reiterate it here. You know, if you were to just watch a highlight reel of chances that Gregor had, you would say, wow, this player must have a ton of points. But the problem is that Gregor just has absolutely zero finish to his game. He is a player who can get great chances, but he can't actually score any goals with those great chances. It kind of reminds me of a player who's currently on the sidelines for the San Jose Sharks, Rudolf Balcers, though in a bit of a different way. Balcers put himself in great positions to score with just his hockey sense and was unable to finish it because he just didn't necessarily have the skill to do so, while Gregor gets into these great positions because of his speed and yet doesn't really have the skill to finish them off. So that's a bit disappointing to see. Maybe I'd like to see Gregor get a bit lower down in the lineup, maybe as a third liner. Maybe that could open things up a bit for him. On the third line, we have the return of Jasper Weatherby. He gets back into the lineup, and he does score a goal here tonight, which was nice to see. I wouldn't say he had a particularly successful game outside of that goal that he did score, but then again, he already did better than the majority of the Sharks players on the team or on the roster here tonight by actually contributing on the score sheet, so hard to really say too much about him. Then, technically not on the wing with Nieto and Cogliano, as Nieto sort of started the game on the fourth line and VL was a third liner, but I just so refuse to have that as an actual line, and I don't think it actually lasted particularly long, so I have Nieto with Cogliano. Nieto didn't really appear in any positive way here tonight. Cogliano also, kind of like Bonino, did have a couple of chances, and that's something that you're going to get from Cogliano on pretty much every night, but he's not necessarily someone who's expecting to just be potting goals here and there necessarily. So I would say that Cogliano still had a pretty decent game, but nothing insane or anything like that. On the fourth line, we had a couple of new faces, or at least sort of returning faces to the lineup, as both Gadjevich and Peterson ended up sitting this one out. VL managed to retain his spot in the lineup for God knows what reason, but he ends up being joined by Scott Reedy, who his previous two games at the NHL came about a month and a half ago, and then Hal Begawatz manages to return to the lineup. However, certainly not with the same level of confidence from Bob Booner as he did when he originally played in the lineup a couple of weeks ago. He ends up with a spot on the fourth line with pretty limited ice time here tonight, which I was still, of course, disappointed by. I didn't think Hal Begawatz ever deserved to be taken out of the lineup, just judging on the two games he did play, and him returning here on a fourth line role with a player like Jeff Viel as his other winger on the other side of the ice is just kind of an insult to the way that Hal Begawatz had previously played. So this fourth line doesn't really generate much of anything. Reedy even got opportunities on the Sharks' first power play, and we know exactly how the power play looked here tonight, so not a lot of success with these three players. On the defensive side of things, we have seen pretty clearly, just based on the past couple of games, that the Sharks are dearly missing the presence of Mario Ferraro on the first pairing, and I don't think there's any other player who's missing him more than his usual defensive partner, Brent Burns, because Burns just had an absolutely awful game here tonight. Just looked like he couldn't make the correct play in almost any situation, especially on the defensive end. He did have the assist on the Jasper Weatherby goal, but that definitely does not make up the multiple misplays that he made in the defensive side of things. His partner here tonight, at least for the start of the game, was Jacob Magna. Magna was a player for when the Sharks were heavily hit by the COVID bug. He stepped in and actually looked pretty good in his role, and I said that he could potentially become the new Sharks' 7th defenseman for the season. That didn't end up happening, as Nick Milosh would end up filling that role, but now Magna manages to make his way back into the lineup as Mark-Edouard Vlasic was a healthy scratch, which I'll mention a bit later. Magna started this game off pretty well. Like I said, the first period went decently well defensively for the San Jose Sharks, but there were a couple of really bad misplays from Magna. The one that obviously stands out is on the Dylan Larkin goal, which was the 5th goal scored by the Red Wings, in which Magna just looked like an absolute pylon as Larkin just sped by him, and Magna didn't even look like he was going to put in the effort to try and catch up on him. So I would definitely not be surprised to see Magna step back out of the lineup for the Sharks next game. When it comes to this duo of Middleton and Karlsson, it's kind of really hard to talk about this duo because Middleton ended up leaving the game. He was the player who was kind of hit in this 5-minute major that ended up getting called, which I didn't really talk about the major itself just yet, just the fact that the Sharks power play was terrible following it. But unfortunately, Middleton ends up going down with an injury. He doesn't return at any point during the game, and while Middleton didn't necessarily have a very good game against the Pittsburgh Penguins, he has been a pretty solid defender for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, and so it would be pretty sad to see him actually out with a long-term injury, something that I didn't think I'd be saying at this time last year. And finally, on the third pairing, we have Milosh and Shemek, and like I said, there is no Mark-Edouard Vlasic here tonight, as this is the first time in his career where he ends up being a healthy scratch for performance-related reasons, and it's kind of like the end of an era, I guess you could say. Obviously, Vlasic has not been the usual Mark-Edouard Vlasic in any of these games, or in many of these games for the past 2-3 years at this point, right? Mark-Edouard Vlasic of 2014-2015 looks very, very different from Mark-Edouard Vlasic of 2020 and 2021, but it actually getting him out of the lineup at this point, where his veteran, his namesake, is no longer enough to keep him as a top 6 defender for this team, is a pretty big deal and a pretty big message sent from Bob Booner. Obviously, Vlasic had an awful game in the previous one, even more awful than some of the other Sharks defensemen against the Pittsburgh Penguins, so I definitely don't disagree with this healthy scratching, but just to say, it is pretty notable move from the Sharks head coach. And finally, moving on to the goaltending, James Reimer continues to struggle from his return. I don't know if he was replaced by his evil twin who decided to try and tank his very, very strong goaltending numbers, but in his last 4 games, it has just been an extremely disappointing set of games for James Reimer for us to watch. He let in 7 goals against the Coyotes. He had a pretty good outing against the Philadelphia Flyers, certainly, though there was that one pretty bad goal in the game-tying goal against Philadelphia, and then he let in 6 goals in just 1 period against the Penguins, and 4 goals here tonight in just 2 periods against the Red Wings. That puts him at 19 goals let in over the last 4 games, and considering he was actually pulled after 1 period against the Penguins and 2 periods against the Red Wings, that's technically 19 goals over just 3 games, or just over 3 games because of the couple of overtimes, which puts him at an average of over 6 goals per game given up over this last just week of play. Really disappointing. Reimer just fallen off a massive cliff here since the return from the COVID/holiday break that the Sharks did have. And Adin Hill comes in relief at the third period, and there really wasn't much better. Certainly didn't have the same level of play as Sawchenko did when he came in relief. Hill quickly led in 2 goals against the Red Wings, the 5th and the 6th goal of this game. They weren't necessarily easy saves to make. I wouldn't say they were bad goals. The Larkin one actually was kind of bad, but the Fabry one wasn't terrible to let in. But right now, with Reimer struggling significantly and Hill obviously not having a good season in general, the Sharks are kind of in a similar position as they were last season when it comes to goaltending. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Buffalo Sabres, a team they have already won against this season. It's going to be their second and final game against Buffalo, and we'll see if they can use a game against a team they've had success against this season to try and get back on track. Class dismissed.